come to the floor today to speak about cybersecurity legislation that we hope will be before the Senate soon. There is no question at all that this is a critical issue that should be addressed by this Congress, and I'm certain that every member of this body is concerned that our nation may be vulnerable to cyber attacks that could have a very severe economic and truly security ramifications. We see stories about cyber attacks daily, whether they are attacks on individuals, on companies, on the government, and I believe that it's time for us to take steps to protect ourselves against this emerging threat. Now, in the coming weeks, the Senate is expected to take up legislation to address this very real problem. And I'm hopeful that this effort will result in legislation that we can all agree is worthy of sending to the President. But right now, it appears that we are on track to follow an all-or-nothing approach. And the problem I see with the bill that is expected to come to the floor, featuring text that was recently released by the Homeland Security Committee, is that it has not gone through regular order and I fear amounts to regulatory overreach. And if that's our only option here, Mr. President, it will ultimately prevent us from making progress on cybersecurity here in Congress, and I think that that would be an unfortunate outcome. And because that outcome is unacceptable, I have introduced an alternative bill this morning, along with a number of ranking member colleagues. I know that Senator Chambliss from Georgia was here on the floor earlier. Many of us spoke to it earlier in the day. We call our bill the Strengthening and Enhancing Cybersecurity by Using Research, Education, Information, and Technology Act of 2012. Has an acronym, of course. It's called the Secure It for short. It follows a common sense approach to address our ever-increasing cyber threats. Our bill focuses on 4 different areas that we believe can draw bipartisan support and result in good public law. And those 4 areas are information sharing, FISMA reform, which is intelligence sharing reform, criminal penalties, as well as additional research. What the Secure Act bill does, and I guess what it does not do is equally important. It does not simply add new layers of bureaucracy and regulation that will serve little purpose and achieve meager results. The Homeland Security Committee bill would arm the Department of Homeland Security with expansive new authorities to review all sectors of our economy and designate what is termed covered critical infrastructure for further regulation. What we hear out there from industry is that this amounts to regulation almost for regulation's sake. And in the electricity industry's case, this is resulting in duplicative regulation that I'm afraid will lead to a compliance-first mentality. Companies will focus on meeting their new federal requirements and passing a seemingly endless string of audits, but these heavy-handed statistic requirements from yet one more federal regulator will not necessarily address the very real threats that we face. So again, the concern is you're going to have industry focused on how do we comply, how do we avoid a bad audit, instead of using their ingenuity, using their resources to ensure that we stay ahead of any future cyber attack. We need to be more nimble. We have to have a more nimble approach to deal with cyber-related threats that are constantly growing and constantly changing. The threat that we see today is not necessarily the threat that we might anticipate tomorrow, so we've got to stay ahead of the game. This is important, and this is where our Secure It Act comes in. I think we've simply taken a more pragmatic approach by focusing on the areas that we know we can find some bipartisan support. Now, one area I think that we can all agree on is that the federal government needs to form a partnership with the private sector. We share the same goals. I mean, that's clear. The goals are to keep our computer systems and our nation safe from cyber intrusions. We need the private companies to be talking with each other and with the government about the cyber problems that they face, as well as the potential strategies and the solutions to combat them. And to achieve this goal, our legislation encourages the voluntary sharing of much-needed information by removing legal barriers to its use and its disclosure. At the same time, we're very careful to safeguard the privacy and prohibit information from being used for competitive advantage. Our bill also provides necessary updates to the Federal Information Security Management Act. This is the FISMA that I spoke to a minute ago. These FISMA reforms require real-time monitoring of federal systems. It will modernize the way the government manages and mitigates its own cyber risks. And unlike other legislation on this subject, the cyber bill that we have introduced today will also update criminal statutes to account for cyber activities. And finally, we support advanced cybersecurity research by leveraging existing resources without necessarily spending new federal dollars. I think very important for us. This straightforward approach to cybersecurity, I think, can go a long way in tackling the problem. Clearly, our own government agencies here need to be communicating a little bit better with one another. An example of this is the White House and Department of Homeland Security are staging an exercise next week. All of the members have been invited to attend and go through this exercise. It is a mock scenario that will feature a cyber attack on the nation's grid. And well, I absolutely think that that is a useful exercise and something that is well worthwhile. I do find it quite surprising that DHS would set up a grid attack scenario and fail to include the grid's primary regulators. These are our Electric Reliability Organization, we call it NERC, and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the FERC. These are the two regulatory agencies that are in place currently that do provide for that regulation, that cyber regulation. It is mandated that within our grid that these agencies tend to just this issue. So it does make me question if DHS is even aware that the electric industry is the only industry already subject to mandatory cyber standards, or that the NERC has the ability to issue time-sensitive alerts to electric utilities in the event of emergency situations. So it's just kind of hard for me to understand why DHS would proceed with a grid attack simulation and not include the existing governmental entities that already have these safeguards in place. And it also begs the question as to whether Congress should provide DHS with such significant and expansive new authorities in the cyber arena. Now, before I close, Mr. President, I'd like to take a moment to talk about the process behind the cybersecurity legislation. Well, my colleagues and I have highlighted the substantive and the procedural problems that are associated with the Homeland Security Committee bill. The majority and even the press have attempted to dismiss our arguments as nothing more than partisan stall tactics. And I stand before you to tell you that is simply not true. I want to take action on cyber. I know that all of the ranking members that have joined together on this issue want to take action on cyber. We need to do it. I have been calling for action and for legislation since last Congress. We've been working on it in the Energy Committee and have moved out that cyber energy piece. But I do think it is important around this body that there is some meaning to the process. The process really does matter. That's how strong bipartisan pieces of legislation are enacted. And when you forego that process and you refuse to do the hard work in the committee, and it is hard, but if you don't do that, you put yourself on a path to failure with that legislation. And so when you have 7 ranking members taking issue with how a bill has been put together, I think you better pay attention to that. I think you need to look at whether or not our process is working. The Secure Ed bill that we introduced today is a strong starting point for us. Some may argue that we need to go a little bit further, but additional layers of bureaucracy and regulations are not the answer at this time. legislating in the 4 areas that we have highlighted in the information sharing, the FISMA reform, the criminal penalties, the research. These are necessary first steps that will make a tremendous amount of difference. And if we need to do more in the future, we in Congress can certainly make that determination. But let's not take an all-or-nothing approach to cyber legislation and ultimately end up empty-handed. I would ask my colleagues to take a look at what we have presented today, ask you to consider supporting the Secure It Act so that we can continue to ensure that our citizens, our companies, and our country are protected. With that, Mr. President, I thank you, and I would suggest the absence of a quorum.